How do we solve more complex problems in a more complex world? Problems like climate change, population growth, or even global health crises. Or, for most companies, something as seemingly simple by comparison as trying to launch a new product successfully. This week's guests are Rosie and Faris Yakob, whose agency Genius Steals helps organizations all around the world solve their business challenges more creatively. So in today's interview, we're going to find out why our modern cult of constant busyness kills creativity, what creativity even is, why it's so often misunderstood or undervalued, and in what ways, why complex problems require more complex solutions and more effective collaboration, as well as some tips from their experience on how to collaborate more effectively. And we'll talk about the business case for diversity and representation, and why that's so important for creative thinking and creative problem solving, as well as some of the practical difficulties that come along with it. You ready? I'm ready. Let's go. Okay, quick note. This interview was recorded last year, just on the eve of the US election, which I've kept in some references just because I think you might find them quite interesting. Oh, and at one point in the video, Rosie does a swear. So, don't watch if you find that kind of thing offensive. Hi, Rosie. Hi, Faris. Welcome to the show. Nice to have you.
Hello. Thank you so much for having us. We're excited to be here.
My pleasure. So let's go straight in. Who are you guys and what do you do? What does your company do?
Well, I'm Faris, and that's right.
I'm
confused already. Okay.
I'm Mr. Rosie, and that's Mrs. Faris.
Yes.
And we are the co-founders of a nomadic creative consultancy known as Genius Steals. And what we do is travel the world and consult and speak, or at least we used to.
Yeah, I would say we help businesses solve problems thinking through the lens of creativity. So we both came from the world of advertising and marketing, leading teams on the agency side of things. So within digital and social media, within the larger creative world, we've worked in digital and PR and more traditional and experiential and events. And one of the things that we found was that a lot of the places we worked, their output was predetermined by their business model. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, but we were really interested in those problems that don't necessarily have the output determined at the start of the problem solving. And so we kind of removed ourselves from that system, became free agents in order to think about some of the more tricky problems while also peddling inspiration and that global arbitrage of knowledge from all these different pockets of creativity and innovation to see how that comes to life.
That sounds like a really wide brief. Do you have any examples of the kinds of problems you solve, or the kinds, maybe some that you've solved more recently?
That sounds like it's more specific, doesn't it? So there are probably three kinds of product that we have. There's a speaking product, which means the problem we solve is you have an hour of stage time and an audience that you want to entertain
or inspire.
And we'll do that. We'll perform a certain kind of thinking for audiences. We will also convert some of that thinking into workshops and training for both ad agencies, marketing clients, and other companies that may want to explore what strategy is and what creativity are and how you might implement those two ideas in your everyday
And
work.
Even that is a wide brief, right? Because that could be with the president of Coke and his 20 direct reports, or that could be with a 200-person media shop in Australia or New Zealand. So even that brief can be wide.
And then we also take on brand and business consulting projects for either agencies or marketing clients or occasionally startups. But it's sort of looking at to your point about breadth. We have quite a broad set of experiences spanning consulting and agency services of various kinds. And so it's kind of like applying some of the creative bits of business to business and applying some of the business bits to creativity, kind of, I suppose.
Yeah, so a couple of things that we've done this year. So we're working with an independent agency in Puerto Rico to help them future-proof their business and think about some new processes and tools to make that workflow go a little bit smoother rather than reinventing the wheel every time. We also got to do a pretty fun project earlier in the pandemic where we got to collaborate with Tim McGraw and Dolly Parton to bring a video to the city of Nashville about, to stay hopeful in this times of COVID when, everyone's affected by this pandemic, but especially the music industry. And it's not just the performers, it's everyone who's affected. And so bringing that message of positivity and hope was a little bit more back to the days of our earlier careers. We got to revisit that production side and actually making a spot. A lot more of the stuff that we do now is on the thinking side of things. And then we also got to do a project with one of the big gaming companies where we did a remote inspiration session for their European team.
So are there any common problems that companies tend to face when it comes to creativity, or employing creativity to try and solve business problems? Are there any patterns that you see, or is it completely all over the place?
No, I think there are. I think everybody has a lot of the same challenges, to be honest. I think the three areas that creativity tends to get disrupted around, perhaps, are things like inspiration, integration, and innovation. So inspiration, so creativity from the way we like to think about it is an input-output function. It's not ex nihilo. It's like a lot of stuff goes in, something happens, other stuff comes out. But we don't think unless something comes in, anything can come out. So there's an inspiration requirement, which is a constant problem in any kind of business because businesses don't tend to have a job code or a timesheet allocation for learning or for absorbing the world.
And being busy kills creativity. And yet that's something that we tend to almost pride ourselves on in the sort of Western world of productivity and work. We're proud to be busy. When you ask anyone in New York or London, often that first response is to how are you? Oh, I'm busy. I'm so busy, man. And then the list of things. And you're like, is that something to be proud of?
100%. And I think that comes down to the integration thing as well, which is that people confuse the execution of things with the thinking of things. And the thinking of things being more abstract is very hard to demonstrate as creative in the sense of making words and pictures or art or whatever, versus creative in the idea of there are problems and there are solutions and you want to try and find the easiest solution to the problem. That's a different way of doing it. And so the pieces don't fit together because people have different approaches and understanding as to what's important, be it inside a large multi-department organization or a team of people. They have different bits. So that's the integration bit. And then the innovation bit, which is just people like to know how to do something and they want to be able to do a thing well, which is sort of the opposite of innovation. And so if you want a new solution, you can't do something is going to work, which is often very confusing and frustrating to people and to companies, especially that don't like that much uncertainty. They like knowing what's going to happen.
Is there a problem, you think, with companies coming to some sort of innovative process and trying to slap on sales targets or growth targets or things to that, maybe too soon or before they understand the nature of what it is they're trying to do? Is that something that you come across?
I would say, more often than not, it's actually that people don't put metrics in the equation at all. It's just not even a thought or a consideration when you're having these conversations so early on. But then, of course, we can be misled by the metrics. So one of the passion projects that we've been focused on this year is thinking about, the larger Genius Steals products and how they're targeting big industries, corporations like the Coca-Colas of the world, the Gibson Guitars of the world, the Nestle's, even the big ad agencies, right? And we wanted to think about how we could reach individuals and think about a different product we could sell for people who don't have the $5,000 to $50,000 training budget and just have a little bit of money and they're focused on learning themselves. And so we've launched the School of Stolen Genius, which is this digital subscription membership-based platform. And for us, the learning experience was so new because we know about content and delivering the content. We know about curriculum, but we're learning an entire new technological platform. And so some of the standards that we set for ourselves at first, we realized very quickly weren't realistic and maybe weren't even the metrics that were important to the current level of success. So one of the things we talk about often is figuring out that feedback loop. What information do you need to help you make the next decision?
Yeah.
Rather than what benchmark are you trying to meet, thinking about metrics, a basket of metrics, a couple of different things that you're looking at the directionality of and that impact what you'll do next.
Yeah,
and then condensing that feedback cycle.
I think that makes a lot of sense. That seems very, you can't measure everything the same way because things operate at different stages of development and or, you can't measure R&D on sales goals because if you did, you wouldn't ever put any money into R&D. So it's like, it's long-term, short-term, it's now versus later. It's kind of that balance.
How do you talk people through that kind of process then? If they're not familiar with it, for example?
I mean, it's sort of what strategy is, which is the idea of strategy is having a bit of a think because you probably want to achieve something. And maybe it makes sense to try and learn a bit about the thing you want to make a decision about. That seems like a vaguely good idea, right?
Yeah.
And then you're like, okay, well, if I do this now and I can't do it in the future or vice versa. And then it's like, okay, well, these time schemes exist. And then it's, do you want to achieve X by a year from now or X from 5 years from now? Because they're quite different things you're trying to do.
And what's your budget? I think that's the other thing is, so when we think about strategy, business strategy, creative strategy, we're talking about the allocation of resources to achieve an objective, right? In competitive markets of uncertainty. So when you just think about that, it's like, okay, I don't have infinite resources, time or money, right? And so with a limited amount, I want to have the biggest impact possible with my resource that I do have. And so thinking through the strategic approach then is, what is that objective we're trying to achieve? If it's a larger one, what's the one that becomes before it? What are those sort of checkpoints that we can use as our Northern Star to see how well we're doing? And then equally, how do we, again, back to those feedback loops, how do we then set those micro projects up and those micro measurements up so that we're also impacting the longer term goal?
Yeah, like I keep trying to think about analogs between personal experience and complex organizational strategic decisions. And one that just occurred to me is that like money is a bit like calories, right? Money, if you're a business, is a bit like calories if you're a person. Like you need them. If you don't have calories, if you don't have calories,
where's the metaphor?
I'm ready for this. Yeah.
If you don't have calories, you die. So you don't exist anymore. So you have to have some calories every day or some money every day or cash flow, right?
Yeah.
Or your business dies. So that's important. We know that. However, we also know as people that some calories that are the easiest to get hold of, the easiest to absorb, the cheapest to buy, will solve the calorific problem in the short term, but lead to unintended negative consequences in the long. And equally, if you harvest lots of short-term revenue opportunities without investing in your health as a company, which is your long-term ability to extract calories from the situation you're in, right? Then eventually you'll have done all the short-term stuff that you should do to survive, which makes sense, but you'll be fat and you'll die anyway.
You're saying I can't survive off of Cheez-Its.
Like I like cake and I just want to eat cake all the time, right? I love cake. If I could only eat cake, I'd be very happy with that. However, I'm aware that in the short term, that will solve the calorie problem. It'll solve the me being unhappy problem. It'll solve the hungry problem. All the things, it'll look very like, from the point of view of our business, that everything is going super well if all I eat is cake. But at a certain point, it won't. And I think managing those two different desires and time frames is kind of what a big part of everything is.
Well, something you guys mentioned to me before we were filming is that you've got this kind of point of view that creativity is non-obvious. Does that link into this? Or, I mean, regardless, I guess, of whether it does or not, like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think when we think about creativity, we try to define our terms because we work in an industry where craft is a big part of the output. When I say craft, I mean, think about when you actually see an ad, there is a set that was designed often. There is, a videographer, a director, someone who has written the script. So you've got, the art and copy coming together, whether it's the print or the digital. And that is a reflection of creativity to some extent, but that's the craft execution of that, right? And so we talk about creativity being, looking at non-obvious solutions, being willing to challenge conventions and to take stock of the assumptions that you might have, and then kind of peel back those layers to look for what are we not thinking of, and how could we solve a problem in a new, unusual way?
Yeah, like one of the things I like to do with words is play with them and see if playing with them exposes what they might mean or not in different ways, right? So when someone says, oh, that's creative, what do we think they mean? Let's say you've got a kid and your kid did a picture of them, whatever, and someone goes, oh, that's a very creative thing you did, Johnny. Assuming they're not just being nice, they probably mean it's like not obvious.
Because if you see a dragon, and your kid draws a dragon and it's a green dragon and it's got teeth and fire breathing from its mouth, you're like, okay, cool dragon, Johnny. But if Johnny draws a purple ghost dragon where he shoots fire out of his butt and his tail is coming out of the side, you might be like, whoa, Johnny,
how creative
of
it might
you.
be being rude, but it's still that would make sense, right? Whereas it wouldn't make sense if it was obvious.
Right.
So it feels like whatever creativity is in some way has to include this idea that it's not obvious to everybody, otherwise it wouldn't be creative. It feels like that word means that,
And when we look at efficacy of creatively awarded campaigns, oftentimes we notice that they're pulling from two concepts that seem kind of far apart and then making that connection. Jokes do this really well. So when we're talking about how this comes to life, we often talk about how jokes take two far away concepts, and the punchline is bringing those two concepts together.
Yeah.
So one of the more common ones, that we like to use, why did the Scarecrow win the Nobel Peace Prize?
No, Nobel Prize would work better, I think.
Okay. Why did the Scarecrow win the Nobel Prize?
Right. I don't know. Why did the Scarecrow win the Nobel Prize, Rosie?
Because he was outstanding in his field. So obviously a Scarecrow, dim-witted, dull, and a Nobel Prize, very smart. And
well, yes, that's important. I think there's two bits, right? It's not just a combination. It's not just a combination.
Yeah.
That's non-obvious. It's also the dynamic tension which holds the least obvious things together makes for a better idea.
Yeah.
So if it was a rabbit or whatever in a field, it would be a bit funny, but not as funny as a scarecrow, specifically because scarecrows are known for being stupid and Nobel Prize winners are known for being smart. So it creates a paradox, or like a thing that can't be resolved with normal logic.
Yeah. So
you have to imaginatively resolve it with humor or linguistics or whatever.
So how valuable is the practice of creativity, as opposed to, and I mean for its own sake, as opposed to going, right, we want to do X, we want to solve this, we're going to have to do it in a creative way because I can't think of an obvious way to do it. But is there value in the process itself?
100%, because creativity is not a single skill. It is think of it more like a muscle to be flexed. So you can do a bunch of different exercises to make sure that when you go to lift something up, you've got that strength. You might be doing yoga, you might be doing weight training. The more things that you've done and the more training you've had, the more practice you've had, the stronger those muscles are, so that when you need to use them, they're there. Because a lot of these things, it's not magic, but because it's not something that we often maybe practice in our day-to-day life, we have that sort of fear factor. And there's a little bit of that fear of the unknown of, will this work? Because we haven't done it before, we haven't seen it in process, we just feel a little bit uncomfortable with that situation. The more we can expose ourselves to the trial and to the challenge in our day-to-day life, then when we need it, we're calling on a toolbox of resources rather than opening up Pandora's box and being like, I've never done this before, but I guess now's a good time to start.
So some of it's practice.
Yeah, practice is definitely, it is something, it's a skill or an approach to thinking about information and solutions. Like, what's valuable mean? Well, it means it's scarce. Basically, what valuable means is that it's relatively scarce, because otherwise it wouldn't be valuable. Okay, so is creativity relatively scarce? Kind of, no. But is non-obvious solutions valuable? Yes, because they are scarce by definition. Their lack of obviousness means they're not scarce, means they are scarce, which means they're inherently valuable, because if only you can do something, you are the monopoly provider of that thing, very valuable. If that thing is something people want to buy. So yes, in that sense.
Right.
More personally, I guess, like culturally, we tend to divorce creativity from money a lot in culture, right? And one of the things that we remind people a lot is that they're not different. Like, creativity is the solutions that unlock the money or whatever. But art, ignoring the fact that art is a market and has money related to it in different ways, the idea of art is perhaps better understood as R&D for humanity. Like, if you had infinite time and money and just set these very smart monkeys off to play, what would happen, right? Because I think in very rare moments where we have massive surpluses, usually because we have monopolies that are churning out money in a way that can't be controlled, like AT&T or Google or whatever, because they're making so much money so fast, they can do things like have labs and create Xerox Park or whatever it is, right? So you just say, you're already smart and you're all different smart. Here's loads of money in time and equipment with no brief. Go and see what happens. But it's really rare that culture has achieved that level of kind of excess to allow for that kind of creativity outside of painting.
Fair enough. I mean, we're talking about different smart. I think one of the things that you've mentioned that is kind of you're thinking about at the moment, as well as diversity. So there's a strong business case with diversity, right? So it's not just about social equality. That's important, but it's more than that, right? There are other benefits to this. So what's your thinking on this? What's kind of the business case or the creativity case maybe for increasing diversity in the working world?
Yeah, so I mean, for advertising and marketing specifically, I think it's really interesting because we are creators and curators of culture, right? We actually get to put things in the world that we say are reflective of the space and time that we live in. So in order to do that, we are putting ourselves in other people's shoes, especially as strategists, right? We might be marketing a rental car company to 55-year-old plus business traveling men. And so we have to put ourselves in that mindset. Now, if we are 27-year-old kids who have never been on a business trip at all ever in our lives, and we have a completely different worldview, that's challenging, not impossible, but challenging. When you start thinking about diverse representation at the table, if we have a diverse team of people, it's unlikely, or it's less likely, that we'll have these huge blind spots because there's diverse representation. So whether that's on the car company or whether that's, we're marketing a product specifically to women, are there women at the table? Because if not, that could be problematic. We need someone to not speak on behalf of women. We need a woman to actually weigh in with something that, might be a unique insight, or might be even a sense check of like, guys, this doesn't speak to me. Or have you realized that this embedded misogynistic, idea is in this video? The fact that even, let's say that a child needs to have a mom and a dad and couldn't have two moms, or couldn't have two dads, or couldn't have mixed gender, parents. It's like that sort of stuff. I think we make these assumptions, and with our own personal biases, how could we not, right? We have our own experiences at heart that we've carried through life for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, right? And so we need other perspectives to remind us that our experience might have been unique to us, and that there might be another experience entirely that's worth thinking through.
I think that's very important. The empathy and the representation part is very important. Like at a sort of ideological level, based on, if you think that creativity is an input and output function, and the ideas are new combinations that require inputs to make things, right? And if you think ideas are good, you are inherently restricted by the amount of stuff in your head. Like, the only ideas you can have are a function of the things that you know. So the more
the input, your own personal input that you've had in your life.
Exactly. So the more people there are involved in a thing, the more the adjacent possible of the ideas is much bigger because there are more inputs that can be combined. So that just makes sense in terms of if what we're looking for is more possible ideas, if that's what we're looking for, then diversity inherently in the way that we think about ideas is a requirement. Like it's just, you can't do it without it, basically.
Yeah.
And then there's also the commercial part of it, which is like, it looks like at a macro global level, companies seem to do well when they serve all customers equally rather than some customers. Maybe, but not always.
2 notes on that. So one is just only 5% of women, 5%, only 5% of women think that brands understand what they find attractive or sexy. So that means 95% of women are going like, no, you have no fucking idea. Oop, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on your podcast.
I might bleep it out.
Bleep it or not. I'll leave it up to you. I've got
is it a podcast? I thought it was a video.
It's a video cast. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse. You know, we'll just come back to that. I have a potty mouth, so it just happens.
Dang.
Yeah, you're getting passionate now. This is the thing. Come on.
Yeah, so
darn.
That means 95% of women don't think marketers or brands understand what they find attractive or sexy, which would be pretty concerning to me if I was trying to sell, I don't know, most things. But like, yeah. And then when you look at women leadership, I wrote this down because I wanted to get this numbers correct, but having 30% of your leadership team or more made up of women, that increases your profit margin by about 6%. And this was a study done by the Peterson Institute across industries, across geographies. So that's not just for marketing and advertising. That's looking at across the board. And I think that's
globally as well, you say, yeah?
I'm sorry?
Sorry, globally as well.
Globally.
Yeah.
And so like, I think that's one of the things too, that's really interesting is it's not enough to just have diverse representation at the small table. We need diverse representation at top because that's often where decisions happen. And so if you have diversity at the very base level, by the time it factors up to the person who's in charge, sometimes that can still get overlooked because again, inherent bias, it doesn't, just because you know that you have some biases that exist within you doesn't eliminate them. It just gives you knowledge that you have them.
Okay, so you basically, the more diversity of thought, the more diversity of experience, the more diversity of maybe talent or the way talent is expressed, then it kind of makes sense that's going to lead to some sort of bottom line boost.
It seems to, both at a sort of evidence level and at an intuitive level, I guess. So it's not as simple as more diverse equals good, obviously, because like collaboration is hard, communication is hard. It's easier for me to know what I mean than it is for any of you to ever know what I mean and vice versa, right? Like, so it's easier, if I can do all the things that I think need to be done, it's going to be easier for me to do it myself than working with anybody else. However, if I can't do all the things that need to be done on the weird assumption that I don't have infinite capacity, right? Then I'm required to collaborate with somebody who can do something that I can't do, right? So that it creates transaction costs. The problem with the challenge with diversity is that it creates more transaction costs, right? Because your point is really well made, both of you, about diversity of thought. Now, often in the PC language distortion doublespeak world we live in, when people say diversity of thought, what they mean is we can still just hire loads of white men as long as they think differently. And I would say, no, that's just you being misogynistic and using words to disguise that fact. But because you cannot have enough diversity inside white men of lived experience to make what we're saying relevant, right? There's just it's not possible because the lived experience is going to be so different in so many different ways, right? And I think that's important, like across discipline, gender,
and
sociocultural experience, age. But then the more diversity you're putting together, the more facilitation is a really important part of management or working, because people who are like each other tend to naturally agree. We tend to get to consensus very much more easily around people who are like us or who we think are like us. Consensus of people who don't think like us or look like us is inherently harder, which means you have to provide mechanisms to help it work.
Yeah. And I mean, to that point too, I think like we were talking about race and gender, but age is really important in the creative industry. So when you look at people who are over 50 who work in marketing and communications, it's about 5%, 5 to 7, depending on what number you're particularly looking at. And then if you look at, let's say, finance is about 22%, doctors about 25%, you jump up to lawyers, about 35% are over 50. And so because we tend to prioritize maybe this youthful energy in advertising. Quite literally, we're requiring loads of hours of your time, and your pay is not going to increase the more time you put in, which maybe means as you get senior, you're less into that idea. But it also means we lose a ton of experience. And these industries, like the technical side of things, they've figured out how to market and to value loads of experience. And when we get rid of that at the senior end of advertising, we miss that lived experience too.
And there is an interesting kind of, to Rosie's point about planning and empathy and something like that. So agencies tend to, for economic and cultural reasons, like younger people, but the people with all the money who do all the shopping in the world are older people.
Yeah.
So 50-year-olds plus have all of the money in all of the world, and they will still have it, and they will always going to have it. So that's just what's happening now, right? So that's an interesting division, right? Also, I'm not saying you have to be a cow to sell milk, but older people have been younger people, whereas younger people have not been older people. So
okay, that's true, yeah.
You get to assume intellectually how you could be, you could understand what it's like being younger as older, but it's harder. It's more inherently imaginative, less empathetic or experience-based, other way around. Yeah. That's all.
Well, I mean, to speak to your point now, I was once asked by somebody what ideas I would have for how to sell insurance to millennials. And I said, well, it's easy. You just wait 15 years.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And then they'll have something worth insuring. But like, this seems to speak to a point that you've also raised before, like before filming, about you think there's this myth of the lone genius that's around. And something else you said, all the single mind problems have been solved. These seems like these are linked, but two very interesting ideas. Do you want to tell me more about that? What your thinking is on that?
You want to start?
Yeah. Okay. Well. Okay. So we have a tendency, because it's easier to think about bits and not systems. Systems are quite complicated, and they're quite open-ended, and they're quite expansive, and they're very hard for our brains to understand non-direct causation like things, right? So something we tend to do a lot is think, how did history work? Some dude did some stuff, like Napoleon. You mentioned Napoleon at one point earlier, and he's a very big guy. I mean, not literally, but his name literally has its own error attached to it, which means like there's some sense just by having those two words put together that he made history of this time by himself. Now, something about that has always rubbed me the wrong way. I don't see how that's possible. I'm like, don't see how Einstein made the nuclear age. I don't see how Napoleon made. I feel like the naming rights to things isn't the same thing as being the prime mover of an entire way of thinking about ideas. And so I guess there is the kind of the Thomas Carlyle's idea that history is the biography of great men, right? This kind of idea that there's sort of like there's forces and there's people, and there's a sort of pendulum that swings in understanding of context between those two things, and it's easier for us to think about individuals and stories and a person, they grew up like this and therefore they had this idea and they did this, than very complex diffuse interactions of stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I take issue with his just his only men history, right. But like that was back before women were allowed to have ideas and stuff, so I'll give him a pass. Carlisle, that
yeah,
is.
No,
not
I
you.
No,
you
no,
no,
I think if he was writing today, he'd probably just say great men and women, but like great persons, great people.
But he didn't mean women. He meant men. He was very specific about it.
Okay, fine.
That was the point. No, because at the time, the idea that women could be part of history made no sense. They weren't allowed to have agency. They couldn't own property. It was like, you don't get to be a player in this game. So,
So thinking about it from sort of, again, our lens of advertising, communications, marketing, it's like when we're sitting in a room and there's an idea that's had, it's like, do you want your idea to win or the best idea to win? And it's this challenge, it's this inherent tension, right? Between like, ooh, I have a lot of heart for my idea, but also I really want the best thing to win. And when we kind of further the myth of the lone genius, I believe that we make it less likely that we can enter those may the best idea win conversations very easily, because the incentive structure isn't there. And right now, the incentive structure more generally is about individuals. I mean, even at award shows, when you see an artist go up to accept an award for greatest album of the year, it's like, did they even write it? Did they, who are the ones who were the best tours? Is Taylor Swift's entire dance crew coming up there to accept it? Like, all of these things take massive amounts of people to make happen. Even something as simple as a commercial, it's like, we put a creative director's name on some winning campaign award entry, but like, who concepted it, who scripted it, who shot it, who edited it, who directed it, who published, like actually made it go live onto the internet or onto some media. Like, already we're now talking 20, 30 people.
Right.
So I think we talk a lot about Brian Eno's concept. He calls it Scenius, and he says this is what we'll refer to as the collective genius, or the genius that comes from a group of people, the intuition of the scene, hence the Scenius kind of thing. And I love that idea. So we often think about what are the conditions that then allow Scenius to happen.
Yeah.
Okay, and they are?
So they are, well, for one, rapid sharing of tools and techniques is a big one. So being willing to, willingly share this and share it with speed. Distribution of credit is another big one. So again, rather than just focusing on that one lone genius, sharing that far and wide.
You've got to manage ego in all endeavors involving humans. You have to manage ego. Yeah.
Another big one is mutual respect and appreciation. So again, when you work on teams where you're pitted against each other, that can lead to fraying tensions. When we try to work with companies who are struggling with the collaboration, we think a lot about empathy exercises. How can we have people do other people's jobs in just the spirit of a small workshop, workshop-based activity, so that they develop that empathy, which leads to at least understanding, if not respect. Because ideally, we're doing the jobs we want to do, and as Faris alluded to earlier, we can't do everything, so we got to have some respect and appreciation for other people and their roles.
And that leads to the sort of single-minded point, I guess, that things get more complex over time. They just seem to have done so far, right? And the things that are determinant interventions in our modern world are all extremely complex in a way that none of us individually have any understanding of, right? It would be very hard for an individual to make a computer or anything else. In fact, it would be very hard for an individual to make an iPhone. It would be very hard for an individual to make a space rocket. It would be very hard for an individual to have a heart to do heart surgery.
Like, I'm looking around the room, and the only thing I feel like we could maybe make here is a table, but a table requires nails, and we couldn't physically make nails on our own. So now we're back, and we need a saw to cut the table.
Yeah.
So it's like, even the small basic things, you can unpack them and realize, like, very quickly.
But they sort of nest. So nails become transistors, and so, like, to be a computer, I have to make microcircuit. Oh, that's a whole. So it's a whole set of nested complexities that no individual has the capacity to understand, even let alone replicate, right? So it doesn't mean that you individually can't go and write a book right now that doesn't change the world. Yes, you can. Everybody can do that. In theory, we can all solve our own problems at least, like, to some degree. But the science operating at the level that changes the world, the Nobel Prize level, that takes 20 years to filter through in economics or chemical terms or whatever, it requires collaboration, because nobody is going to be expert enough in enough disciplines to get to the solutions that we need that will solve for population growth, a closed planet system, tax avoidance, whatever.
That's everything. Okay, let's wow. Although it leads into the thoughts I had about digital trends, though. Both of you guys have this background in kind of, or you made your names, perhaps you could say, your professional names in kind of writing social trends, digital trends, stuff like that. Now, so you've seen a lot of change. So I'm just wondering, like, what do you think are some of the deeper ways that digital trends have changed the world that you've seen, that you've had to work with and respond to? And on the other flip side, what ways has the world then started to shape the digital trends?
Interesting.
We make our tools and our tools make us, as somebody.
Looks that way, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I think, one of the things that I got to do early on in my career was work on Oreo. And we had a program called the Daily Twist, which was all about putting a positive childlike spin on some news of the day. And that process led to this tweet during the Super Bowl, you can still dunk in the dark. And people sometimes credit that as birthing real-time marketing. And so I think now, like very quickly, the CEO of 360i, Sarah Hofstetter at the time, she quickly reframed that to our clients as, forget about real-time marketing. It's all about right-time marketing. And I would say that's something that's had more longevity than the real-time marketing, is thinking through that right-time marketing. So that's something that stands out to me. I'm thinking now post-pandemic, just how much our world has changed overall, but how some of the things that have been a little bit more familiar to Faris and I from our constant travels over the past 7 years and not having an apartment or home base since March of 2013, we've been maybe more familiar with the home office setup and have had this handy little conference speaker, multi-way mic. I mean, we've had this for, several years now. And so the home, we heard it phrased as, home is now headquarters. And that can come to life in a lot of different ways, whether it means you're working from home setup, or for me, big shift is digital fitness. I'm a huge fan of yoga, but I always like going to classes wherever we are. And for the most part, I thought I had it figured out. Yoga, you don't need equipment, you don't need tools, you don't really even need to speak the same language for it to work. But with the pandemic and no longer being allowed to be in a studio, I've now relied much more on the digital fitness approach. And I think that's something that will likely be a longer than COVID impact.
100%. I think home as headquarters. I was thinking about that. Sorry, I got distracted because we don't have a home, and yet that insight is still interesting and relevant to us. The way I was articulating it in my head was like work from wherever.
I love that.
WFW, because we don't have a home.
Okay.
We have to work, and so we have to be able to work from wherever. And there are certain things there are certain kinds of work that it's really hard to do from a constantly moving situation, and certain works that's easier, whatever. So the context is important. But I was also thinking about trends are fun because like you get to look at something and go, in 20 years it might look more like this, and we've been doing that literally professionally for 20 years now, so we can sort of have a little check-in with ourselves and go, how did we do? And mostly it's been pretty right, but like, which is comforting.
Faris is much better at articulating the trends in both a pithy way and in a public way. So I feel like he has more of a way to like pull up a tweet from 7 years ago and be like, told you so.
I've been blogging for a long time. I have evidence of my predictions. Some of them are wrong, but they exist, and you can check them and stuff. But what I was thinking is that ultimately all the things we've been talking about since the first time I got digital thinking, I was a management consultant before I was in marketing, and I was a digital business consultant in 1999. There's a lot of excitement around that kind of idea that kind of went interestingly. And essentially, like, it's just pipes, right? What makes things different is how big the plumbing is. If the plumbing works, then things are different. And if the plumbing doesn't work, then it doesn't. So like Zoom works because there's enough bandwidth and an expectation and expectations of video cameras on most computers, and an expectation of stable bandwidth across both so for video conferencing to be a thing that works with a reliable enough fidelity to not be annoying, so we can use it, right? And the same is true of like, so there's 2 or 3 pipes that matter. There's the speed parameter of computers or phones or whatever. There is the bandwidth, like how much stuff can you squeeze through the computer, and then there's availability. Where can I get the bandwidth? If not everywhere, then those places are less good than the places where everywhere is, right? And when it's completely everywhere, that will be different. I think when we hit this level of, you can assume that everybody in the world has a robust video data connection, then I think things will be, that's what we've been talking about for 20 years. That's what we're still talking about. We're not even close to being there yet. We're not even halfway there yet. But even in that not half, a lot of interesting stuff clearly has already happened, right? But it's when it hits ubiquity, then I think that's going to be real interesting.
On the other side of things, one thing that's interesting is that we've been talking about for years and years now, in part because my lovely and super smart husband wrote a book and is also an author. So his book is called Paid Attention. So we've been thinking a lot about the nature of attention, mainly because, you know, once you write a book about things, people expect you to have something to say about it, and then they pay you to say those things about it, right?
Yeah.
So we've been thinking about this for 7 years now. And now in the public and some of those, let me even take a step back, because what have we been saying about attention for 7 years? Well, one is that it's not a commodity, and that we have to think about, in the nature of advertising and communications, it is treated as such, as something that can be bought and sold. And right now we've reached what we like to call peak attention, which is like peak oil. It's not that all the oil is gone. It's just that all the easy to mine stuff has been taken away from us. We used to have free time. Now we've got these magic computers that go everywhere with us, and they can tell us anything that we would want to know at any given time. And so we have no free time. Any attention that brands or companies want, you have to take away from someone who's already distracted with the magic computer in their hand, right? Yep. And so thinking then about the ethical and moral implications of being a marketer and of using people's attention wisely, and not taking advantage of that, not taking more than you give, like creating a value exchange or equation of some capacity, I think is really important. And Faris developed a media pyramid, which kind of takes the food pyramid and applies it to media, and looking at reported psychological well-being and how that might impact you as an individual, whether you're within the communications world or being marketed to. And now these sorts of conversations are starting to enter the mainstream. Like The Social Dilemma is something that was on Netflix as one of the most popular movies. Yeah. And it was surprising to us how many people were surprised, because again, this is stuff that we've been talking about for 7 years, and now it's entering the public conversation. It's not just colleagues, it's the whole wide world is thinking about technology in a slightly different way.
Well, talking about that, this is something that's very close to my heart at the moment. Well, it has been for a while. You have a knack for being able to explain concepts, I think, pretty well. And we've talked about complexity, about rising complexity. Things are getting harder to do without more and more collaboration, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you go about looking at communicating complex ideas, complex technologies in creative ways?
Well, that's a good one for Faris. He's great at that.
No, it's a really hard question, to be honest.
I know, but that is why I'm asking it, because I want to know the answer.
Well, okay. So the marketing answer is that you don't communicate the complex bits, you communicate the easy bits, which is people's benefits, right? What do I get out of it is always going to be some set of basic things. Security, sexual prowess, whatever, right? The things that we promise people when they buy things they'll get more of, right? Yeah. Basically, it's either security or sexual prowess. Those are the two things that drive humans. I want to be safe, I want to get laid, whatever. Procreate. Basically, right?
Cool.
I mean,
it's boil it down to that. Okay, yeah.
Take Maslow's hierarchy and smash it into a couple of boxes. If you want. But like, it's that kind of survival is important. That's probably useful, and you know. But I believe that sometimes when you render complex things simple, you make them wrong. So I don't think you can just take complex ideas and say, here is a simple way of saying, like. Probabilities and stochastic things in general don't work well in simple language, and when you do that, it tends to be wrong. So a scientist will get angry about it and confused when you say this is, it's like, well, it's not exactly that. But like, we did some work with the Wellcome Trust on this project, on this area, right, which is that their job is to communicate science to some degree, their mandate for their trust. But communicating science in a way that everyone gets can make it wrong, and so scientists hate that. However, what's more important is getting people to get the bigger ideas that are valuable behaviorally, like, you know, washing your hands is good for some reason, right? You can't explain necessarily how aerosolic transmission of disease works. You could, but it wouldn't help. what would be help is understanding either through the simple thing you need to do and or a metaphor that they can understand. Metaphor is often the solution to this problem, basically.
And then there's nothing else.
I mean, it could be. I don't know.
It's hard. You have to pay us the big bucks for that.
Well, no, because I think about it, right?
Yeah, okay, fair. Well, I mean,
well, no, but it's not. It's
I'm
so.
kidding. I'm kidding.
So it is a real challenge. It's a real problem.
Yeah.
Communicating science is now so complex that only other scientists can understand it. Scientific papers are incomprehensible because they're written for scientists to anybody who's not a scientist. And we, my brother's an epidemiologist. I read his papers. It's very hard to decode the science into something we can understand and explain. So it's a real problem that we're facing. And the problem, one solution to it is to go, oh, it's all nonsense, and reject everything and decide you can pick whatever you want to believe. That's a solution that a lot of people are going with at the moment. And it's not a very good one, in my opinion, because there's a difference between being, we don't know how to be more right versus being completely wrong. They're not the same thing, right? It's like, oh, doctors don't all agree. No, but all doctors are more right than you. Yes. All of them, yes. Without any exceptions, yes. Every single doctor is still more right than you. Even if they're wrong, yes. Even if they're wrong, they're still more right than you. So it's like understanding that is hard for people. They're like, well, why should I believe them? It's like, because you're an idiot. That's why. And you're always an idiot because the stuff we need to know is way too big. No one's going to know it. So you're an idiot. Except
that's the British way of saying it, and the American way of saying it. Not everyone is idiots. And maybe it's about media literacy. And another way in is thinking about, when we have complex topics and we have to break it down to the different sort of levels. Maybe one way in is thinking about teaching people the skills in which to understand and evaluate the complex concepts first. For example, who is trying to sell you what and why might be a way that we could help people think about more complex issues at a broad abstract level rather than getting into the specific issue that we're trying to understand.
Yeah.
So looking at agendas or
motivation. Yeah, of course. I mean, and everyone has one, right? It's like all communication is some kind of persuasion. And so if you're thinking through really anything, it's like, what is someone trying to communicate to you? Why might they want to communicate something with you like that? Even the social dilemma. It's like, okay, the guys who made the movie have companies that are based on getting you off of your devices. So when you look at the argument from, the tech monsters that are saying hey, be on your phones for as long as you want, all good here. It's like, well, obviously they have a vested interest in you staying on your phones. And then you look at another side and it's like, oh, these two people who, they were the design ethicists and they used to work in these big companies. And now they have other companies that are based on getting you off of your phone. What might they be interested in trying to do? And then thinking critical thinking required. And again, this is abstracting the complexity question because critical thinking is always required. And I think that's maybe part of what we miss when we get to the complexity is that you can't talk to everyone. You can't be everything to everyone. You can't answer a question for every single person unless it's, rooted in fact and not in opinion or in sales and persuasion.
So there's always ulterior motives and there's always motives because that's how people do things and stuff. But beyond the idea of motive and agents interacting in competitive environments, which is what kind of we're talking about, I think there's also, it's worth understanding what complexity is in philosophical and mathematical terms rather than being a synonym for complicated, which it's not. So in mathematical terms, a complex system has certain criteria that makes it behave certain ways. So a simple system is simple. A complicated system is simple, but you could has many layers that can be modeled but work mechanistically. Let's put it this way. So so a lock is complicated, right? A lock in a door is complicated. A cloud is complex.
Oh, I like that.
Because complex systems are typified by many interacting agents, which create stochastic inevitability, which is to say a complex system cannot be predicted. like the stock market or the weather or traffic or when you have a heart attack, it can't be predicted specifically by the nature of the system because it's not mechanistic or deterministic. It is random. Because when you get a certain number of interacting things inside a closed space, randomness happens for reasons that involve maths, apparently. So that's what complex means, which is inherently unpredictable.
Yep.
As in, no matter how smart you are, how fast your computer is, the nature of reality in those situations cannot be predicted, which I think is really an important part of it.
Okay, well, talking about the social dilemma then, talking about these things that you were talking about in one way or another 7 years ago, if not even longer.
Yeah.
What's going on that you think the mainstream is going to be talking about in 7 years from now?
This election.
Yeah, for sure.
What, still?
20 days. Yeah. I'll be more specific. I am struggling, despite having had some success in considering what the vectors of current context suggest strongly will happen in the future. Despite that, am struggling greatly with looking past November the 3rd at the moment, I would say.
I mean, I think more broadly, we could talk probably about, and it's hard because will people still be talking about it? I don't know, because maybe it's just such a part of normal life. But one of the things that I thought was interesting is just how many people are using grocery pre-order and ordering apps now. Like, it feels like that was something that was very much fringe dwelling society, unless you happen to live in a place like New York and London, where it really was a pain in the ass to carry loads and loads of grocery bags home. And even then, like, Ocado still wasn't at, peak usage in the UK, even last year when we were there. So you're seeing a lot of jumps of like that I think will probably still remain in effect even after the pandemic, just because it's such a lubrication that you're like, oh, I don't really need for there to be a pandemic for it to make sense to go ahead and pre-order this stuff.
Yeah, less facetiously and geopolitically.
Yeah.
Like, a couple of different things occur, I think, in my opinion. One, which is like, no one likes change, but if they're forced to do things and it's easier and more useful, they'll keep doing it. So if a lot of people who didn't want to do online ordering suddenly do it and it's easier and better, they'll keep doing it. That seems like it's true. I also think I have a friend stroke acquaintance called Bill Buxton, who is a designer and researcher at Microsoft, and he was involved in the development of the first multi-touch screens that are in your iPhone now. He says what he calls the long nose of innovation is always 20 years long, even though we think it's not. And his point of view on this is that even though each S-curve of technology seems to be accelerating at certain points, between invention and commercialization and everybody having one because it's cheap, it takes about 20 years. Because inventing something by definition means it's not around and it's not easily available to make cheaply. Then you've got to work out, I invented it. What can I do with it to sell it? And then you've got to make it loads of them to make it cheap. And you can't do the cheap part until you've made a thing to sell, and you can't do the selling part until you've made a thing. And they always take about 20 years.
Where are we on the driverless cars?
Probably, when did they get
like,
invented? 7-8 years ago, but halfway through, probably.
Because I think, that could be something like, there are a couple of driverless cars in the city now that's like a taxi system. So maybe in 20 years, we'll be talking about like, oh my God, remember the days when you could drive your own car and when it wasn't automated?
Yeah.
Maybe.
No, but totally. I mean, 100%. So I think it's very rarely novel stuff that comes in and suddenly, iPhones couldn't exist until multi-touch computing existed several years before in a TED talk, and then someone saw it and said, I could put that into it. So it's like the components have to exist, and that always takes time for culture to absorb technology and then work out how to sell it to itself and what it's for and stuff like that. So I think whatever's going to happen is already happening, and it's not well distributed in like the very famous quote by William Gibson, the future is already here but not well distributed, right?
Yeah.
So virtual reality has been around since the 80s. It clearly isn't here yet. It may be here in the future in some form. Yeah. But it's taken a lot longer than we thought this time around.
I mean, I'm also super curious to see how travel resumes and in what capacity. Like, I wonder if 20 years from now, we're like, oh my God, remember when you didn't have to wear masks on a plane? Like, I don't know if that ever, I mean, even if that stops in day-to-day stuff, once there's a vaccine that's widely distributed, I wonder if that stops, like, in travel scenarios. Like, I don't know.
And looking at the clues that already exist, right? A lot of countries now, you can't go to them without a yellow fever vaccination. There are certain countries that require you to have vaccination passports to get into those countries because their local infrastructure isn't sustainable. It's not robust enough to take on these new dangerous diseases that they think they can control otherwise. So, so the idea of an immunology passport will probably become a default thing for travel, right? You won't be able to travel until you can show what vaccines you have. That seems like it's inevitable at this point, but how long it'll take,
Yeah.
All right. Well, last point then, I think. So related to this, but more specific, I guess, to what you guys do, which is, how do you see the kind of creative work that you do kind of evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? And what sort of impact will that have on sort of the day-to-day lives of consumers, do you think?
It's a good question. I think so. The work we tend to do tends to be trying to catch up with things, or before they become important, and then telling people downstream about them. So be it digital at an early point, or kind of a broader approach to creativity, let's say in advertising terms, right? One of the things that we both, to your point, made our careers on was trying to encourage the industry to understand that bits of film and pictures and words aren't the only things that constitute what advertising could be in the world. Just because you like making those things doesn't mean that's what they have to be, right? And the same is true now, I think, which is like what constitutes the field of creativity, what constitutes a medium, is changing faster and faster, right? We have a good friend who has just gone to work for the lovely Facebook in their mixed reality research laboratory. So like, that is a medium that no one knows how to develop, design games, experiences, ads, world, whatever you make in those things, no one knows yet. So that's part of it, right? It's just going, we have to relearn creativity every time for a new medium. That's always a part of what we're going to be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to do a desire and a hope rather than a specific prediction, which is that while I appreciate all of the remote Zoom stuff, I really hope that because we're not I don't think we're going to go back to offices. So I don't think our work goes back to offices in the same way. I think offices become meeting spaces, and you just have like little creative kind of times to regroup and to manifest and create. And so I'm hoping that our work evolves to get to include bringing people to physical spaces, and specifically people from different industries and different organizations. Like, back to that diversity of thought, you know, we have a real problem in our industry with sharing. It's like we want to keep everything private and to ourselves, and we don't want to tell anyone how we got there, what happened, and everything was magic and everything was amazing and serendipitous. And I think there's a lot of magic that comes through the discomfort of having tough conversations about potential mistakes or possibilities and not knowing which way forward. And I think getting people in a room and off the computer to have those will be really valuable. So that's something that I hope we can manifest in 5 to 10 years, maybe not in
I like the hope
months.
approach. I like hoping seems good.
Yeah.
I guess
Do you have a hope then?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I hope to. So I guess if anything, if creativity could be understood in its broadest sense as not just the domain of left-leaning aesthetes, or if it could, like, if creativity meant like creativity of supply chains and creativity of ecologically useful disposal, and if it wasn't just creativity of vanity and art and also creativity of money, you know, if there was more to it than that, and that we could all appreciate that beyond just I think that would be really cool. It feels like the kinds of creativity we're going to need will be systemic and integrated kinds of creativity that solve the big problems like, oh, I can't breathe anymore, or why does no one pay taxes? Or those kinds of problems feel like they need to be creatively solved. But the way we think about creativity culturally, not we, but the world, is that it's like it's a department, or it's like it's not what grown-ups do, or it's like, it's the fun bit. It's what they call the coloring in department, right? In very disparaging terms.
God, yeah.
Right? And that's obviously very hurtful. But at the same time, it's like, that's because culture has a pocket that says that's a thing, right? So if we could all realize that we have to be creative just to get out of bed in the morning, and that we could respect the creativity of everybody else's kind of daily lives, then maybe we'd learn to appreciate the creativity that isn't just cool design and things that make headlines, but kind of things that, you know, might help.
Right.
Yeah,
So nice note there.
I think, and last thing too is just 5 to 10 years down the road. I mean, that's a long time. I think the School of Stolen Genius, like it's probably going to be huge at that point, and we'll just have a billion people who are just creative thinkers collaborating with each other all around the world.
I see it as a sort of franchise operation with offices in lots of countries. Yep.
But in the meantime, we're doing these experimental learning communities with, it's like a mastermind type program with leaders from around the world, 7 weeks, meeting an hour and a half each week, talking about any sort of topic ranging from challenging conventions to peer assist. And every single thing that we're doing, it's a live exercise with other people in our industry and with other creative thinkers, but it's also something that is abstractable, that you can take and abstract and apply back to the marketing department within your own organization. So maybe the 5-year plan for that is let's get, bigger, grander ELCs in person. Who knows? Maybe they're not experimental at that point because we've been doing them for 5 to 10 years. But I think this school is going to be something that, we don't think we're going to become not nomadic. We don't think we're going to pick a place and stay there. That doesn't feel like that's in the near future for us. It might be, but it doesn't feel like that's in the near future for us. So I think instead our future is around continuing to build community, but in these sort of remote pockets through the lens of marketing and creative.
I think we all need, no one's smarter than everybody, and we all need everybody else to remind ourselves of that fact, right? And it could just be that I'm getting to be middle-aged, and that leads to certain changes in the way that you think about reality and mortality and business and how you spend your time. Might be, right?
Could be.
But it feels like to me that people are beginning to ask bigger questions more broadly, not just when they're students, not just when they're in India on acid, not just, at the 2 or 3 junctures of life where you're allowed to think big questions and then go back to work. And, I think people are beginning to ask questions at a social level, at a structural level, at a personal level, that are beyond survival or are about survival in other ways. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what it feels like to us. And I think we are going to lean into those bigger questions somehow and try and muddle our way through with other people.
And be more about actions rather than ads. I think that's something that we have talked about before and that keeps coming up, especially this year, is what are the actions that we can work with brands to take rather than just the communication about the actions. And so I imagine 5 to 10 years from now, we'll be preaching to the choir when we talk to brands about actions over ads, and it'll be a no-brainer.
Well, that's a nice thought to leave it on. Just as a quick bit of information then, where can people go to find out more about the School of Stolen Genius?
Yeah, so we're super tricky. So it's hidden sort of URL, School of Stolen Genius, no .com. You just put the dot between the I and the US. So it's School of Stolen Genie, I.US, and then that's the URL. And our membership is $25 a month. And it's something stolen from around the world, like a research report or something new. So some sort of thought that we have, framework, tools, template, and something live, it could be a live book club, it could be a community meetup. And then we also have a private group on Slack. So a lot of global marketers connecting, creative thinkers, sharing tools, techniques, templates there as well. And like I said, we have experimental learning communities.
You can find me mostly on Twitter. I'm at Faris on Twitter. That's easy. Just like Paris, but with an F. Twitter.
I'll put some details in the description box. So
Okay, sounds great.
Like and subscribe.
All that good stuff, right? But thanks very much for your time, guys. Thank you, Rosie. Thanks, Faris. It's been great.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. This was super fun.
If you made it to the end of this video, why not leave a comment or a question below? I'd love to know what you think about some of the topics we've discussed here today. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it. And do subscribe to the channel if you want to stay up to date with all my videos as they go live. So thank you so much for watching, and stay curious.